That night changed everything in ways I never expected. It all started with a simple request from my stepmother, Caroline, asking me to stay home while my father, Mark, went on his usual business trip. At the time, it felt normal. After all, it was just the two of us most weekends. But I didn't realize that this night would lead to something far beyond the ordinary. A night that would push the limits of our relationship and leave a lasting mark on me. The house felt unusually quiet that evening. My father's usual presence was missing, and the silence felt strange. I had just finished my college assignments and was ready to relax when Caroline called me into the living room. "Can you help me with something?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too casual. I could tell she was nervous, but I couldn't figure out why. I hesitated for a second. "Sure, what do you need?" I asked, walking over to where she sat. Caroline usually had a calm demeanor, but today something felt different. She smiled, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made my heart race. "Come sit down," she said, patting the cushion next to her. I did as she asked, unsure of what was coming but curious about what was happening. Caroline leaned back, crossing her legs and looking at me with an expression I hadn't noticed before. "You've grown up so much, Oliver," she said. Her tone was light, but the words felt heavy with unspoken meaning. "You're not the little boy I used to know." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't like her. We had always had a friendly, casual relationship, but today felt different. "I guess," I mumbled, unsure how to respond. She leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, really," she insisted. "You've changed, and I think we both know it." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. A strange tension filled the room, and I didn't know how to break it. "Caroline, what are you trying to say?" I finally forced the question out. I needed to understand what was happening, why the air felt so thick with unspoken words. For a moment, she didn't respond. She just looked at me, searching my eyes for the right words. Then she sighed and stood up, walking over to the window. "Your father's gone for the weekend," she said quietly, staring into the yard. "It's just the two of us here." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was heading, but feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft. "There are things I've wanted to talk to you about, things I've never had the courage to say until now." I swallowed hard. "Like what?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "Like us," she said simply. The word hung in the air and my heart raced. What was she implying? This didn't make sense. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out shaky. "What do you mean, us?" Caroline smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my stomach flip. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. "The way things have changed between us. We're not just stepmother and stepson anymore." My mind was spinning, trying to catch up with her words, but deep down I knew exactly what she was talking about. I had felt it too, the subtle glances, the lingering touches, but I had always pushed those feelings aside, convinced they weren't real. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my voice barely a whisper. She stepped even closer, her presence overwhelming, and suddenly the room felt much too small. "Yes, you do," she said softly, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. "You felt it too." I stood up abruptly, stepping away from her, trying to clear my head. "Caroline, this is crazy," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my stepmom. We shouldn't." But she didn't back down. She followed me, closing the distance between us again. "Why not?" she whispered, her eyes burning with intensity. "We're both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules." I shook my head, trying to resist the pull that was drawing me closer to her. "No, this isn't right," I insisted, though even as I said the words, I felt my resolve weakening. "But what if it is?" she countered, her hand reaching out to touch my cheek. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I was frozen, trapped in the web she was weaving around us. I wanted to say no, to push her away, to run out of the room and forget this ever happened, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, and I hated myself for it. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every time I saw Caroline, I felt the weight of what we weren't saying pressing down on me, suffocating me. But I didn't know how to confront it or stop the slow, inevitable pull dragging us both toward something dangerous. The days blurred together. Every interaction felt loaded, like we were walking on a razor's edge. I tried to keep my distance, avoiding being alone with her as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. She always seemed to find a way to be close, to make her presence known. Whether it was a casual touch on the arm or the way she looked at me from across the room, it was always there, this simmering tension that refused to go away. Then came the night everything changed. My dad was working late and I was trying to stay holed up in my room, hoping that if I avoided her long enough, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I could hear her moving around downstairs, the sound of the TV playing softly in the background. The clock ticked loudly on my wall, each second dragging on, making it harder to ignore reality. I thought about calling a friend, making up an excuse to leave, but something kept me from picking up the phone. Instead, I found myself standing outside my room, listening to the silence that had settled over the house. It was too quiet, too still, and that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I walked downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Caroline was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, her gaze distant as she stared at the TV. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did but pretended not to. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, unsure of what to say or do. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and I knew there was no turning back. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too casual. There was something in the way she said it that made my pulse quicken, the same way it had that first day. "Yeah," I mumbled, not trusting myself to say anything more. I walked over to the couch and sat down, leaving as much space between us as possible. But even with that distance, I could feel the tension, thick and unspoken. Caroline took a sip of her wine, then set the glass down on the coffee table. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Oliver," she said softly, her voice carrying something unspoken, "do you ever think about what if things were different?" "I've been thinking about us," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Caroline, we can't," I started, but she cut me off before I could finish. "Or not?" she asked, turning to face me fully. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words hit me hard. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that we couldn't go down this path, but the truth was, I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I had felt it too, the strange pull between us that had only grown stronger. I had tried to ignore it, convinced myself it wasn't real, but now, sitting here with her, I couldn't deny it any longer. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Even as I spoke, I knew I was lying. She leaned in closer, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice low and intense. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that settled over my thoughts. "But it's not right," I argued weakly. She reached out, placed her hand on mine. The simple touch sent a rush of electricity through me. "Who decides what's right and what's wrong?" she asked, her gaze never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I wanted to pull away, to tell her to stop, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the moment, by the feelings I had been denying for so long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she whispered, her fingers tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "We can decide for ourselves what's right." I closed my eyes, trying to block out her voice, the feel of her touch. But it was no use. The walls I had built around myself were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Before I could say anything, before I could gather the strength to pull away, she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much my body responded to her, how much I wanted to give in. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her that this was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But no words came out. Instead, I found myself turning to face her, my breath catching in my throat as our eyes locked. The moment stretched on, the tension between us growing thicker with each passing second. Then, without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters, unsure of what would happen next. But the kiss quickly deepened, the heat between us rising as we gave in to the desire that had been building for so long. My hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in my hair. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. I knew it was wrong, knew that we were crossing a line we could never come back from. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. As the kiss deepened, my mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. I knew this was dangerous, knew that we were playing with fire, but there was a part of me that didn't care, a part that had wanted this for longer than I was willing to admit. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our faces inches apart. Her eyes were dark, filled with something I couldn't quite name, and I knew that things would never be the same between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled between us, thick and undeniable. I should have said something, anything, to break the silence, to stop this before it went any further, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. Instead, she reached for me again, her fingers gently tracing the curve of my jaw. "Don't fight this," she whispered. "Not anymore." I exhaled shakily, my resolve crumbling. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was too late to pretend that this wasn't real. And as she leaned in once more, as our lips met in another searing kiss, I knew there was no turning back. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin, "and I know you have too." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was too much for me to handle, too overwhelming. Instead, I just nodded, my heart pounding as the weight of what we had just done settled over me. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. The kiss had only been the beginning. There was more. There would always be more, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Caroline, we can't," I started, but she cut me off before I could finish. "Well, not?" she asked, turning to face me fully. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words hit me hard. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that we couldn't go down this path, but the truth was, I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I had felt it too, the strange pull between us that had only grown stronger. I had tried to ignore it, convince myself it wasn't real, but now, sitting here with her, I couldn't deny it any longer. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Even as I spoke, I knew I was lying. She leaned in closer, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice low and intense. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that settled over my thoughts. "But it's not right," I argued weakly. She reached out, placed her hand on mine. The simple touch sent a rush of electricity through me. "Who decides what's right and what's wrong?" she asked, her gaze never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I wanted to pull away, to tell her to stop, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the moment, by the feelings I had been denying for so long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she whispered, her fingers tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "We can decide for ourselves what's right." I closed my eyes, trying to block out her voice, the feel of her touch, but it was no use. The walls I had built around myself were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Before I could say anything, before I could gather the strength to pull away, she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much my body responded to her, how much I wanted to give in. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her that this was wrong, that we couldn't do this, but no words came out. Instead, I found myself turning to face her, my breath catching in my throat as our eyes locked. The moment stretched on, the tension between us growing thicker with each passing second. Then, without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters, unsure of what would happen next. But the kiss quickly deepened, the heat between us rising as we gave in to the desire that had been building for so long. My hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in my hair. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. I knew it was wrong, knew that we were crossing a line we could never come back from, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. As the kiss deepened, my mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. I knew this was dangerous, knew that we were playing with fire, but there was a part of me that didn't care, part that had wanted this for longer than I was willing to admit. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our faces inches apart. Her eyes were dark, filled with something I couldn't quite name, and I knew that things would never be the same between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled between us, thick and undeniable. I should have said something, anything, to break the silence, to stop this before it went any further, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. Instead, she reached for me again, her fingers gently tracing the curve of my jaw. "Don't fight this," she whispered. "Not anymore." I exhaled shakily, my resolve crumbling. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was too late to pretend that this wasn't real. And as she leaned in once more, as our lips met in another searing kiss, I knew there was no turning back. After that night, everything changed between us. I couldn't look at Caroline the same way. Every time our eyes met, I felt a rush of heat, a reminder of what we'd done and of the unspoken promise of what might happen again. The air in the house seemed charged with something dangerous, something we both understood but didn't dare acknowledge openly. Days passed in an intense, awkward silence. I kept my distance as best I could, but it was impossible to avoid her completely. Every brush of her hand, every passing glance felt like a spark threatening to ignite the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but there was a pull between us that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One afternoon, while my dad was out again, the silence in the house felt unbearable. I was pacing the living room, trying to distract myself with the TV, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. The memory of that kiss, the way her lips had felt against mine, the way my heart had raced. It was all too much. I hated myself for thinking about it, but I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard her footsteps behind me. I turned to see Caroline standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension between us thick, heavy, with everything left unsaid. "We need to talk," she said finally, her voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable, even if I wasn't ready for it. "Yeah," I agreed, my throat tight. "We do." There was a long silence between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. The air felt thick, charged with the same dangerous pull that had led us down this path in the first place. I could feel the tension building again, pressing down on me, making it impossible to think clearly. Then, before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "I think about it too." I barely had time to register what I'd said before I wanted to take it back, but it was too late. The moment the words left my mouth, there was no undoing them. Caroline's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and in that instant, I knew there was no going back. We had already crossed a line, and now we stood on the edge of something even more dangerous. She didn't say anything at first, but she didn't have to. The look in her eyes told me everything. There was heat there, a need that mirrored my own, and it terrified me, but at the same time, it thrilled me in a way I couldn't deny. "We can't keep doing this," I said, though my voice was shaky, uncertain. Even as I spoke, I wasn't sure I believed it. Caroline's gaze never wavered. "I know," she whispered, "but we're already here, aren't we?" The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but I couldn't move. I wasn't trapped by her. I was trapped by myself, by my own desires, by the pull that was too strong, too overwhelming to resist. Before I could process what was happening, she leaned in. Her face was inches from mine, her breath warm against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest. For a split second, I thought I might be able to stop it, to pull away before it went any further. But then her lips were on mine, and all rational thought disappeared. This kiss was different. It wasn't hesitant or unsure. It was charged with all the tension we had been holding back, the desire that had been building for so long. I kissed her back without thinking, my hands gripping the couch to ground myself. It wasn't about love or affection. It was about need, a raw, burning need that neither of us could control. My mind spun, thoughts slipping through my fingers like sand. All I knew was that in this moment there was no turning back. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. The weight of what had just happened hung between us, thick and unshakable. But neither of us moved. Neither of us wanted to break the moment. "We have to stop," I said again, but my voice lacked conviction. Caroline nodded, her breath warm against my skin. "I know," she whispered, "but it's so hard, isn't it?" I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. We were caught in a web we had spun ourselves, and no matter how much we told ourselves we needed to stop, the pull between us kept dragging us back together. And that's when it happened. She leaned into me again, and this time neither of us resisted. It all happened so quickly. As thrilling as it was for me, she seemed lost in it too. After it was over, she smiled at me, her expression soft, satisfied. That look alone told me she had enjoyed it just as much as I had. The next few days passed in a blur. We tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had happened, but it was impossible. The tension between us was undeniable. Every time I saw her, I felt that same rush of heat, that same dangerous pull. It was like we were circling each other, waiting for the moment when we would finally give in again. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, when my dad was out late for work, I found myself in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by making dinner. But the silence in the house was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't focus. Every sound seemed to echo, each one a reminder of the weight of what we were doing, of the choices we had already made. Then I heard footsteps behind me. My breath caught, and I didn't have to turn around to know it was her. I felt her presence before I saw her. The air between us crackled, thick with everything we weren't saying. "What are we doing?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caroline didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body behind me, close enough that I could feel the pull of her, stronger than ever. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't think I can stop." Neither of us moved, neither of us breathed. The moment stretched between us, electric, unbreakable. And then, just like before, we crossed the line again. The weeks that followed blurred together. Stolen moments, fleeting glances, the constant weight of our secret pressing down on us. We lived in two worlds, one where everything seemed normal, and another where we hovered on the brink of something we couldn't control. The more we tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. Every time my dad left for work or stayed out late, we found ourselves drawn together again. Every touch, every look was a step further across an invisible line we should have never crossed. But it was never enough to make us stop. If anything, it only pulled us closer, as if something bigger than both of us was guiding us down this path. One Saturday afternoon, the air in the house felt especially thick. My dad was at a company event and wouldn't be back until late. I felt the shift the moment I woke up that morning, the quiet anticipation settling in my bones. I knew something was going to happen, something we wouldn't be able to come back from. Caroline was in the kitchen when I walked in, washing dishes with her back to me. She must have known I was there because she didn't flinch when I entered. I hesitated in the doorway, watching her, unsure of what to say or do. This dance between us had become routine, and I knew the steps all too well. She turned off the faucet and wiped her hands on a towel before facing me. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with everything we weren't saying. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine. I wasn't. I hadn't been for a while, but how could I admit that? "I don't know," I finally replied, my voice barely audible. Caroline stepped toward me, stopping just a few feet away. "I've been thinking," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "Maybe we should talk about what's been happening." I tensed, unsure if I was ready, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. "What's there to talk about?" I asked, my heart hammering in my chest. She sighed, rubbing her forehead with the back of her hand as though trying to massage away the tension building behind it. "I don't know. Maybe we need to figure out where this is going. We can't keep living like this, pretending it's not happening." She was right, but I didn't want to hear it. The very idea of confronting this thing between us, whatever it was, made my pulse race. "Where do you think it's going?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Caroline flinched slightly, but she held my gaze. "I don't know," she admitted, her tone quiet yet resolute. "But I do know we can't keep tiptoeing around it." Frustration roared through me, and I ran a hand through my hair, feeling as though I were on the verge of snapping. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, not because I was angry with her, but because I didn't have the answers either. "Do you want me to say this is okay? That I'm fine with it? Because I'm not. I'm not fine with any of this." Her expression softened and she took a step closer, shrinking the space between us until I could feel the warmth of her presence. "I don't want you to be fine with it," she said quietly. "I just want you to be honest, with yourself and with me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, because I knew exactly what she meant. I'd been lying to myself for so long, convincing myself that if we ignored it, this thing between us would fade. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop wanting her. The more I fought it, the stronger it became. "I don't know how to do that," I admitted, my voice raw. "I don't know how to be honest about this." Caroline reached out and rested her hand gently on my arm. That slight contact sent a tremor through me, and I hated how much I craved it. "It's okay," she whispered, her eyes full of understanding. "We'll figure it out together." Something in her voice cracked the barrier I'd been holding up. Without another thought, I pulled her closer, kissing her like she was the only lifeline I had. The kiss was slow and deliberate, not frantic or desperate, as if we both realized we had to savor whatever time was left. When we finally parted, our foreheads met, our breaths mingling in the narrow space between us. "What are we doing?" I asked, hardly aware I'd spoken aloud. "I don't know," she murmured, her voice trembling. "But I can't stop." Neither could I. In the days that followed, we fell deeper into whatever this was. More stolen moments, more secret touches that felt like they were keeping both of us alive. It became harder and harder to pretend nothing was happening. The tension between us was electric, impossible to ignore even though we tried. Still, I knew it couldn't last. There was a shadow over everything we did, a ticking clock I felt in every breath, reminding me that all this was temporary. Eventually, something had to give. Then, one evening, everything unraveled. I was in the living room, the TV on mute, my head miles away. Caroline was upstairs, and my dad was supposed to be out late, or so I'd thought. I barely registered the sound of the door opening until he walked in. "Hey," he said, scanning the room before his gaze settled on me. "What are you up to?" "Watching TV," I replied, my heart pounding. My voice sounded too tight, too forced, but I couldn't help it. I tried to act normal, but the guilt roiled inside me, thick and suffocating. He settled onto the couch, flipping through the channels like any other night. I fumbled for composure, desperate to hide the storm in my chest. A few minutes later, Caroline came downstairs, her face composed, but I could see the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She greeted my dad politely, as though nothing was wrong, yet her hands fidgeted at her sides. That night's dinner was pure agony. Every word felt forced, every question weighted with unspoken suspicions. The walls seemed to close in each time my dad spoke, and I couldn't look at Caroline without panic tightening around my heart. She avoided my gaze too, and I felt the tension between us thrumming just beneath the surface. After we finished eating, we started clearing the table. My dad suddenly turned to me, his expression impossible to read. "You've been spending a lot of time with Caroline lately," he remarked, his tone calm but probing. My stomach lurched. I glanced at Caroline. She had gone pale, her eyes wide with dread. I guess," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. He watched me, and the silence stretched. "Anything you want to tell me?" he asked. There was an edge beneath his casual tone, something that made the blood in my veins turn cold. I opened my mouth, searching for an explanation that might shield us both, but nothing came. Every excuse died on my tongue. Under the table, Caroline's hand grazed mine, a silent plea for reassurance, but it only made the situation more unbearable. "No," I finally whispered, my throat tight. "Nothing." He didn't respond right away, just held my gaze. I felt like he was looking straight through me, seeing everything I was trying so hard to hide. In that lingering silence, I knew the truth hung between us, unspoken yet tangible. Eventually, he nodded, but the tension in the room remained, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Caroline and I finished cleaning in silence, and my dad retreated to another part of the house, leaving us both shaken. Later, after he'd gone to bed, Caroline and I found ourselves alone in the dimly lit living room. We didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. There was no escaping this. The knot of guilt and longing in my chest felt too big to ignore any longer. I sank down onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. "I can't keep doing this," I muttered, my voice muffled by my palms. "I feel like I'm going to explode." Caroline sat beside me, close enough that I could feel her warmth. She hesitated, then placed a hand on my arm. "I know," she whispered, leaning in. "I'm scared too." I lifted my head, meeting her gaze. "It's all going to come out, isn't it?" She nodded, her eyes glistening. "It can't stay hidden forever." The enormity of it all crashed over me. My chest tightened, and I fought the urge to bolt from the room, from the house, from the entire situation. But there was nowhere to run. Every path led back to this moment, to these choices we had made. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Caroline swallowed hard. "I don't know. But whatever happens, we have to face it together." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of our secret, of the lies and half-truths, pressed down on the silence. I didn't know if we were being naive in thinking we could handle it, or if we had already passed the point of no return. But one thing was certain. We couldn't pretend anymore. She laced her fingers through mine, and I squeezed her hand in return. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the only thing tethering me to sanity. "Okay," I whispered, voice hoarse. "We'll figure it out. Even if it all comes crashing down, at least we'll know we tried." She rested her head on my shoulder, and I could feel her unsteady breath against my neck. We stayed that way for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the house, both dreading and anticipating the moment when the truth would inevitably spill out. Neither of us knew what the future held, but for now, in the hush of that living room, we only had each other, and that had to be enough.